Hello, I am Anawiltos, and today I will be looking at some of the questions that I received for my question and answer segment. So I received a total of 14 questions, which is pretty good for a first time. So let's get right into them. So I decided to rearrange the questions to have some of the more serious questions towards the end. So if you don't hear all your questions right away, you know that they're coming. Okay. Anyway, first one from Amphibian Hoplite is why the name Anawiltos? And this is actually a very interesting question. Well, no, it isn't that interesting. But for those of you who do not know, it is a sort of pidgin, a combination word between two languages of Greek with a Greek and Latin, and the ana part meaning to repeat, and the wultus coming from wult, which means to will, us at the end, implying a personhood. So someone who wills, anawiltos, someone who repeatedly wills, therefore, or someone who re-wills. It is a reminder to myself to persevere and to continue and to never give up. That's essentially what it is, and that's what it means. Someone who perseveres is another way to translate it. It's a word I made up, so if it doesn't follow all your favorite grammatical rules, you know why, because it's a word I made up, but I do find it a bit important to me. So anyway, that was good. I think we spent around 2 minutes on that question. At this rate, we'll be here for quite some time. Perhaps we can get a full hour in. Holy cannoli, just imagine that, a full hour of me answering some amazing questions. Anyway, next question from Amphibian Hoplite. Which system of pronunciation is your favorite? Classical, ecclesiastical, or modern? So for those of you who don't know what exactly Amphibian Hoplite is talking about here, I believe Amphibian Hoplite is referring to the different methods to pronounce Latin. Now, of course, it is notable that from the very beginning of Latin, in the pre-classical ancestral forms of it, all the way to today, there have been many different forms of it, and of course local dialects, and some dialects have eventually diverged so much from the original language that they are whole new languages unto themselves. So we've got French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, if that is a proper name for that language. There's probably another name for it, and others as well. But this is specifically asking about Latin. So the three main ways to pronounce Latin are classical, referring to the classical era, specifically usually around the early Empire, late Republic. That's probably usually what people mean when they talk about an ideal classical pronunciation. Ecclesiastical, which means pertaining to the church, is the type of Latin that is spoken or was spoken to some extent throughout the Middle Ages in the Roman Catholic churches. Of course, recently the Roman Catholic Church moved away from having actual sermons in full Latin, but it is still widely known among Roman Catholic clergy, I believe. And modern, I guess, would be some... I don't actually know that much about modern pronunciation of Latin. But to be honest, probably my favorite is or my preferred is classical, simply because that is the form that has a lot of interesting literature, at least interesting literature to me. I even have in Latin a copy of the Gallic Wars written by Julius Caesar, and I can comprehend it to some extent, but I haven't had full formal training with Latin, nor am I fluent in it, or have I ever had a conversation with it. Therefore, I'd have to say that I am not very experienced in Latin. However, having learned Italian and having lived in Italy in the past, that definitely allows me to understand a bit more Latin than if I had not. Anyway, the next question from Amphibian Hoplite. When you started your Zero AD series, you mentioned that you played a similar game before. What is it? Okay, so I don't remember exactly what I said at, I believe, whatever episode of Zero AD that was that came out. But by similar game, I presume that I meant a real-time strategy game, as there are many such games around, and I have played them for quite some time. So to mention a few games that I've played Empire Earth 2 was a game that I used to play a lot back in the day. The other game is it's not Empire Earth, it's my goodness, my mind today, I don't know what happened to it. My goodness, I'm trying to remember. I actually thought about what I was going to say yesterday, and I remembered it then, but it slips my mind now, so I'm going to just pause for a moment. Okay, now I remember. It's Age of Empires. I've also played Age of Empires 2 as well. The reason I didn't remember was because I said Empire Earth 2 first, and that already put the word Empire in my head, and I'm thinking I already mentioned the game with Empire in my head, but Age of Empires is also there. I've also played Age of Mythology, which is a sort of spin-off game from Age of Empires. And I believe Age of Empires had a great influence in the development of Zero AD, now that I remember. And other games that I've played that relate to strategy, but that aren't real-time strategy games, are, of course, Armies of Gielinor, which is a game that Jagex put out that's a turn-based strategy game based on RuneScape. I've also played Mount and Blade Warband, which is a mixture of real-time tactics, and I guess the big map part of the game, you could call it simultaneous turn strategy, because it is still turn-based in the sense that when you're not doing something, it's paused, but when you're moving, you move, but when you move, everybody else moves at the same time as well. So I guess that is like that a bit. Stronghold Crusader is a real-time strategy game, and I really love that game. I've also played Stronghold Crusader Extreme, and Stronghold 2, Stronghold Legends, I believe, is the name of that one title. And I tried playing Stronghold Kingdoms, which was a MMO type game, but the problem I had was that it's one of those games, sort of like Clash of Clans, where you have to wait for stuff to happen. I believe that's how Clash of Clans works. Anyway, there's a lot of games that I've also played where you have to wait for stuff to happen, and then it really annoys me having to wait real lifetime for stuff to happen in game. But I've also played several lesser real-time strategy games and turn-based strategy games on various websites as Flash-based games, and I've also played Civilization 3. So I do have some experience in a number of different strategy games. So I guess I hope that's a good answer for what your question was. I believe it is. Well, of course. I think there's no way to misinterpret the question. When you started your Zero AD series, you mentioned that you played a similar game before. What was it? And there you have it. I gave you a list of games that I have played before Zero AD that are somehow related to strategy in one way or another. Do you still remember how you got Zero AD Alpha 18 back then? This is referring to my earliest Zero AD videos, where I started with the Alpha 18, and strangely enough, this question befuddled me slightly when I first read it, because it seems to have a strange context to it, implying how did you get it, as if somehow it would be difficult to get. But then I remembered that, of course, I had actually had the game for quite some time before I actually started playing it on video, and I didn't actually play it off screen either. I think I started it up once, but it had a learning curve, and there were some other games I wanted to play, so I dropped it. And then I waited for several months, perhaps over a year even. I don't remember exactly what the time frame was between when I first downloaded the game or when I first started playing it. But certainly I do have to say that the game, I downloaded it from the website. That's how I got it in the first place. So however long ago that was, that's when I got it. Okay, so now I move to some questions relating to FreeCiv, given to me by the YouTube account FreeCiv-Web, or FreeCiv-Web, I guess is another way to say it. And these questions begin, what do you think of FreeCiv-Web? Well, I think that it's a very interesting game. It definitely is an effective game in its genre, I'd have to say. And it, well, let me think. I'm thinking about what specifically I want to say. I find it enjoyable. That's definitely the thing that matters when playing a game, that you find it enjoyable. And not only is it enjoyable, but it also has a lot of replay potential when you play it, which is also very good in a game, to have a lot of replay potential, unless you're having a really strict story-based game, and in which case the replay potential is entirely dependent on the game mechanics. But in this case, or on whether there's multiple endings, but in this case, with a turn-based strategy game where you can just pick up one of dozens of different countries and play it, and you can choose which direction you want your tech to go. You write your own story, and the same thing with the international relations with your neighbors. You get allies, you get enemies, you get a nemesis even in some instances. And that's not something that's simply about FreeCiv-Web. I think that's something about most turn-based strategy games in general. You just write your own story, and you follow your country throughout history, watch it grow, guide it along the way, and pick your play style. Maybe you like to RP a bit, maybe you like to min-max, maybe you like to do a little bit of both, and it's just a load of fun. And I think that's what makes it a good game. So yeah, I'd have to say it's definitely a good game. Next question from FreeCiv-Web. How do you think FreeCiv-Web can be improved? I I'd just like to say that I haven't played Free Civ Web as much as I've played some other games, so I may still have a very limited perspective on the game. Maybe if I don't know. I actually don't know. I guess one thing one could do is I don't know really. It remains to be seen. However, I'm not going to let this question go unhindered. Unhindered. It's not an enemy. Why do I call it unhindered? What I want you people out there to do in the comment section, all of you who have played Free Civ Web, I want you to think about something that maybe bothers you in the game, or maybe that you think is a bit wrong, that you think can be improved. I think now that I think about it, one thing that maybe it's not so not the best. I actually have the game open in another window, so I'm just going to quickly do something with it just so that I can take a look at the thing that I'm specifically thinking of. Yeah, okay. Here's the thing I'm thinking of. If you have... perhaps I should take a screenshot of this. No, let's not. But anyway, when you open up a city screen, you see the numbers. And then you next to the image where you see the city and you see the numbers of what's on which tile, you see city information. And it's not straightforward in the sense that you don't know which one of those numbers is food right off the bat. You have to guess it a bit. There's a little bit of guesswork involved. And I think that's definitely something that could be improved. Maybe you put a little color square next to the food, next to the production, next to the other things, so that people know exactly what the squares on the mini-map in the city screen talks about. Because otherwise, if you're a new player, you're going to get very confused because you may not know which one is the white number and which one is the yellow number and which one is a green number. I think that's something, just for the sake of clarification, it's not a game-breaking problem, but I find myself looking and sometimes I just don't see it right away. And that's definitely what needs to be done in order to help a bit with that. So anyway, let's get back on track. Next question. Can you suggest one new feature for the Free Civ Web? A new feature. I'm going to just quickly look at the game itself again, just to see if there's something I really want. This is something that's really going to take a bit of thought from me. Let me see. Let me see what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking about units. Is there naval trade? That's what I'm wondering. Is there naval trade? Okay. Recycle units as home city. Because I know you've got the I know you... Well, never mind. You can just put the caravan onto a boat and do that, I suppose. I don't know exactly what a new feature would be. This is, of course, always a difficult question. It's always a difficult question to have someone ask you, well, what do you think can be added to a game, not something that can be tweaked? For example, the thing that I talked about earlier is really more of a tweaking, where you just put a colored dot next to a word so that people know what it means. That's but a whole new feature. Holy cannoli. Let me think. Well, I guess nah, that wouldn't be a good idea. Let me see. Okay, I'm still thinking. Sorry, I might record. I might stop recording so that I have a good think about this. But I want to think with an open mouth. I want to speak out my words so that people hear what I'm saying, and people know what I'm thinking about. It's I'm looking at the research tree because that's probably the best way to think about new things that could be added. I'm thinking. No, we already have sanitation. Okay, I was thinking, well, plumbing. No, we already have sanitation, so that's already a feature. Explosives. I see. Trenches. How about that? Trench lines. I don't think that's in the game. What a trench would be, it would be an improvement that you can put down on a tile. You can put it down on a lot of different tiles, but it links together sort of like a road, but what it does is it gives a defensive bonus on whoever is standing on it, sort of. I'm thinking about how exactly that would work. This is, yeah. Now let me look at the manual. City improvements. No. I'm looking at the manual. Control diplomacy units. Let me just take a look at the worker. Or never mind. But anyway, my goodness, I'm really going off track. I'm not talking enough. That's the problem. I'm not talking enough. You don't know what I'm thinking of because my mouth isn't open. But yeah, trench lines. How about that? That's an idea. Trench lines. Okay. Next question from FreeCivWeb. As an open source game founded in 1996, do you think FreeCivWeb currently violates any copyright or trademark laws? Now, I am not an expert in copyright or trademark laws. However, being a YouTuber, I do have some experience in them, and I'd have to say no, because it's a game of a genre, and as such, it counts as at least fair use, or at most fair use, and at least a game of the same genre. I don't think it violates copyright or trademark laws, because simply it has things in the game that are not really trademarkable, or at least I don't think many of the game mechanics are trademarked. If they are, I'd be surprised, but I think simply because of the nature of a genre. I think it's difficult to trademark such things, so I don't think it violates any trademark laws, to the best of my knowledge. Okay, number 5. What specifically do you think it is? What specifically do you think it is that makes games such as FreeCiv so addictive? Now, I personally wouldn't use the word addictive because it has more negative connotation. I'd use more the word captivating, or enjoyable, or immersive is another way to say it. But I think it's, as I said earlier, it's just the replayability of it. You get to make your own choices, and there's 100 different choices you can make that have vastly different effects on how the game runs out. Not runs out, but on how the game plays out. And just all these different choices gives it a huge replayability. And another thing that's really fun for a lot of people is playing with friends. That is definitely a very fun thing to have. And that's my answer to that question. Number 6. What do you think is the cause of the video recording issues that you have when creating FreeCiv videos? This is a more technical question. I don't know. I can't really say what exactly it is. The best I can tell you to do is to maybe get OBS and try recording gameplay for maybe 30 or 40 minutes straight, and then see whether or not it's corrupted, because that's what I did. Other than that, I can't really think of any other way to have repeatability of the error. As well, it is notable that my last 3 videos had an absence of the recording issues that some previous videos had. And that could be because of some precautions that I took, which is to stop recording and start again so that it can't just be frozen on one screen. But I really have no idea. And I'm not very skilled at programming or coding or looking at the code, so I definitely am not the person to ask when trying to fix this. But I have to say that the error definitely occurs before the editing process, and at the latest point during the rendering process, when the video or when the recording program spits out the file, the raw footage, that's what was corrupted. And and the early appearance of the error in the videos that were published was because I didn't watch the raw footage all the way through before editing and publishing it. But that is where the issue lies. It springs from there and then goes backwards. I don't know how far back it goes, as in I don't think it's the game, because the game runs fine. Obviously the game screen is working well. It's just somehow a problem with either OBS, and by the way, OBS doesn't have a problem recording other things, so I don't know exactly why it would with this, or it's just the graphics of the game interacting with OBS that could be the problem. But the best advice I can give you is to download OBS and just record 30 or 40 minutes of footage. See if you have the same problem, and that's it. But recently I haven't had the problem, so hopefully I will not continue having the problem. Also, OBS doesn't have massive massive raw footage files like Fraps does. So if you're worried about that being a problem, I just have to say that at least it's not Fraps, which gives massive raw footage things. Also, I recently made a video and tried to record straight while also keeping a performance thing, and the error did not crop up in the video, but also my computer was not overworked during making the video either. So it does not confirm that there is a linkage between my computer being over-processing or something and the video quality going bad, but it also does not confirm that the opposite isn't true, because my computer didn't work all the way hard as it would have. Okay, 7th question from FreeCiv Web. Holy cannoli, this video is going to be very long. What is the meaning of life? Holy cannoli. That is a very open-ended question. And I think the reason that a lot of people have problems answering the question is because it's a very vague question to ask, because it requires a lot of context for defining the words in the question. For example, what do you mean by meaning in this context, and what is life in this context? And then what is the meaning of life? So there's a few different ways to approach this question. One way is to look at it from a biological standpoint, asking what is a life form? What defines life is another way, a definitional way to look at the question. The other one is to ask, what is the purpose of life? Or what is the value of life? And that's another perspective to take on that. And then those can be combined, and you can use different definitions to solve different problems. But I have a confession to make about what my particular worldview on such subjects is. Okay, but memes aside, let's just say that definitionally, the viewpoint that a lot of people have had is that life requires the ability to reproduce, and therefore viruses are not considered life forms because they can't reproduce themselves, and they require the genetic code of another organism in order to reproduce. And as such, prions are generally not considered life forms. But another way to look at what a life form is or isn't is to look at whether it has a consciousness or not. And of course, that would say that plant life isn't a life form. But generally, I say that if it can reproduce, then it is a biological life form. And that is not to say that people who are impotent are not alive. That is not to say that. It's just to say that as a general life form. But as for the purpose of life, as you may already have guessed, I have a very specific perspective on that, and that is that all things are to the glory of God. And well, that's my opinion. But anyway, let's actually move on to the next segment. Okay, do you prefer republic, or democracy. So now I'm actually going to go and look at what the FreeCiv manual, the FreeCiv online manual, has to say about what the difference is. So first of all, republic. Under a Republican government, citizens hold an election to select a representative who will govern them. Since elected leaders must remain popular to remain in control, citizens are given a greater degree of freedom. Citizens under the Republic become unhappy easily, but the self-sufficiency of your citizens allows high levels of trade. Okay. So the essential portions here are that there are elections to select representatives who will govern. And, of course, these are popular elections. Now, of course, there are other forms of republics wherein there's different levels of suffrage. For example, there's some where it's only landowners, or it's based on how much income you have, or sometimes certain ethnic groups are restricted from it. But generally, all non-citizens are always restricted from voting because of logical reasons. And citizens are given a greater degree of freedom. I believe that is as opposed to some of the other government forms, such as monarchy, communism, and despotism, which are mentioned. Anyway, now let's look at democracy as defined by FreeCiv Web. Under democracy, citizens govern directly by voting on issues. Democracy offers the highest possible level of trade, but also offers the most potential for unhappiness. Citizens become very upset during wars. Okay, so the essence of democracy, according to this, are citizens governing directly by voting on issues, as opposed to voting on representatives. So this is this allows a populist form of government where the popular issues are ones that pass. Democracy offers the highest possible level of trade. There's a lot of trade freedom. Now, of course, that is not necessarily true, because if people are allowed to vote on all the issues, then they can also vote to restrict trade to some degree as well. But in-game, that's what it does. In-game, it's got the highest possible level of trade, but it offers... Okay, citizens become upset during wars. Now, let's actually take a look at the Wikipedia definitions. Oh, it actually opens up inside FreeCiv. That's how cool FreeCiv is. It opens up the Wikipedia page inside the game. That is cool. And democracy, according to Wikipedia, says, in modern usage, is a system of government in which the citizens exercise power directly or elect representatives from among themselves to form a governing body such as a parliament. So according to Wikipedia, it could go either way. It could go direct democracy or representative democracy. Democracy is sometimes referred to as rule of the majority. Western democracy, as distinct from that existed in pre-civilized society, is generally considered to have originated in city-states such as classical Athens and the Roman Republic, where various schemes and degrees of enfranchisement of the free male population were observed before the form disappeared in the West at the beginning of late antiquity. Okay. According to political scientist Larry Diamond, democracy consists of 4 key elements. A political system for choosing and replacing the government through free and fair elections. B, the active participation of the people as citizens in politics and civic life. C, protection of the human rights of all citizens, and D, a rule of law in which the laws and procedures apply equally to all citizens. Now, I have to say that this is very agreeable. Now, of course, let's also take a look at what the Wikipedia definition for republic is. Let's take a look real quick. Okay, a republic, Latin res publica, is a form of government in which the country is considered a public matter. Not the private concern or property of the rulers, and where offices of state are elected or appointed rather than inherited. It seems pretty common so far. It is a government where the head of state is not a monarch. In American English, the definition of a republic can also refer specifically to a government in which elected individuals represent the citizen body, known elsewhere as a representative democracy, in parentheses, a democratic republic, and exercise power according to the rule of law, a constitutional republic. As of 2017, okay, very well. And let me just see if there's something else that's relevant here. No, there isn't. But generally, republic means that it is a government that is for the people, while a democracy means it is a government by, well, if you combine democracy and republic, you end up with government for the people, by the people, of the people, depending on which order you want to put those things. But generally, I have to say that there isn't that much overlap. Well, no, there is a lot of overlap, actually, is what I mean. Forget my previous statement. I was thinking inside out. But anyway, if you do make a distinguishment between the two, generally the distinction that is made is that in a republic, as opposed to a democracy, there is a greater amount of constitutional restriction as to the kinds of things that can be enacted and cannot be enacted, and you have a lot more checks and balances. And also in a democracy, you're more likely to have issue-based voting in addition to voting for leaders, if you have leaders, depending on whether or not it is a direct democracy, in which case you would still have leaders, but just not leaders of the same kind as you would in a representative democracy. But overall, I have to say that while it appeals greatly to me to have a government in which people can do whatever they want, it also opens up the problem of the tyranny of the majority, which we see crop up in history over and over again, wherein a majority of people hurt a minority, and because of a either dictatorial or democratic process which favors such action, there's nothing that the minority can legally do to defend themselves. And as such, I prefer republics, with the caveat that they are democratic republics wherein the people rule. But of course, my opinion on monarchy is that, like all governments, each government is... The goodness of each government is based on who is the leader. And the republics and the democracies counteract this problem that hereditary monarchies have in making you have a generation wherein you have a bad leader, and you can't really control that too well. by allowing a fast turnover in government as opposed to a elective monarchy, which means that citizens get to more frequently vote who they want their leaders to be in order to reward or punish bad performance, and also they can let me think of what I was going to say. They can also punish or reward good or bad performance in leaders, and also by it being a popular vote as opposed to a hereditary or an appointment, it gives a sort of balancing. It gives a sort of balance. It balances out so that you generally don't have as many bad leaders. Of course, if it's an appointment or if it's a hereditary thing, it is random whether or not you have good or bad leaders. But I have to say that if you have a perfect monarch, then I would pick that over a democracy or a republic any day. If you had a perfect monarch, simply because it's perfection. You can't do anything better than that, so you might as well have a monarchy. Now, of course, this is a very Christian perspective to take because, of course, Jesus, or maybe you don't know, but let's move on to the next question. Okay, which free civ government is most similar to the current U.S. government led by Donald J. Trump? Now, this question is a very, not inflammatory question, but it can be controversial to some extent. But I have to say that the best way to go about this is to look through all the free civ governments. So I'm going to do that one by one, just going to read the quick description. Anarchy... okay, good. Had a problem with a tooltip. Anarchy is simply the absence of any recognizable government. Citizens are disorganized and unproductive, and will spend all income as quickly as possible rather than paying taxes or conducting research. This is not what the United States is like under Donald Trump. It simply isn't, because there is a recognizable government, and there are citizens who are productive, even though there are some people who are very unproductive, especially some of those rioters. They can be very unproductive. I've never actually encountered a riot in my life. I consider that a good thing. And will spend all income as quickly as possible. That is not happening in the United States at the moment. However, it could happen if another great economic downturn hits. Okay. And next one for government. Tribal. Under a tribal government, you are part ruler of your people. You control over your citizens is maintained largely by spiritual counsel. Compared to despotism, a tribal economy is more shield-oriented. Okay, that's game stuff. But under a tribal government, you are part ruler of your people. Your control over your citizens is maintained largely by spiritual counsel. It definitely isn't tribal. It honestly isn't. Because there aren't tribes, and there's the bureaucracy. Holy cannoli, the bureaucracy. It's a big mess, but it exists. So there's no way it can possibly be tribal. Under despotism, you are the absolute ruler of your people. Your control over your citizens is maintained largely by martial law. Compared to tribalism, a despotic... Okay, so... that does not exist in the United States. And I'm glad it doesn't, because it's got to be said, Donald Trump has made a few blunders, and he's not perfect, and that's why I wouldn't want him to be a despot. You don't want an imperfect person ruling over you. That's in such a manner. Now, of course, let's take a look at monarchy. Under monarchy, a king or queen serves as a hereditary figurehead for your government. Now, emphasis here on the term figurehead. This implies that it is not necessarily a rule wherein the king or queen has absolute power, because I think that would actually go more towards despotism. But Donald Trump is not a king or a queen or a god emperor, as much as some people out there on the internet would like him to be. He is just a man who is elected to be the president of the United States of America, and will eventually not be the president as soon as he either doesn't become reelected the next term, or doesn't become reelected the term after that, or if he is impeached, which isn't a very nice thing to do, but some people want to do it nowadays. Now, of course, the other party, there's a lot of Democrats who want to impeach Trump, just like there were a lot of Republicans who wanted to impeach Obama. So I guess the shoe is on the other foot now. And anyone who now goes around, hypocrite, not hypocrite, but criticizing people specifically for doing something that they themselves have done, really is being a bit hypocritical nowadays. The best thing is to just acknowledge your positions and acknowledge the things you have done in the past. Communism. A communist government is based on the ideal that all people are equal, all goods are owned by the state rather than by private citizens. Communism gives a balance between military and commercial styles of government. Communism is not present in the United States. The ideal that all people are equal. So there's a few different ways to define that. There's the idea that all people have equal rights and should be treated equally under the law. There's the idea of all people should have an equal starting point, in which case the government puts a lot of funding into education and heavily taxes inheritances. And then there's the equality of outcome, in which everyone is paid similarly and doing such things. The last two are probably the ones more popular among communists. The second to last that I mentioned, the equality of starting point, isn't necessarily a communist thing. It's more of a socialist thing. So the United States is not a communist country. Donald Trump doesn't seem to want communism, and I'm glad about that, actually, because communism generally doesn't work very well. Fundamentalism. Okay, fundamentalism is a form of government organized around a central set of beliefs. The beliefs, usually religious in nature, form a rigid guideline for actions and reactions of both the rulers and the people. In a fundamentalist society, the people and the rulers are entirely devoted to their beliefs and are usually willing to die to preserve them. Okay. So, I don't believe that the United States has this either, because the United States has a church and state distinction. Now, it's important to mention that a lot of people take it out of context into implying that nobody in the state is allowed to ever say anything supportive of a church, or to have any public events relating to a church. But what it actually means is that you're not supposed to force people into participating in specific religions, and the government shouldn't be directly funding a specific religious institution. For example, let's say the Roman Catholic Church. Now, that being said, this doesn't mean that the government can't work together with a church for other things that are unrelated to the things that I mentioned. However, there are some people that get really annoyed by this kind of stuff. And those kinds of people are generally disapproved of by both religious people and even many atheists alike, who just think that these people are just too angry at... I mean, just take a chill pill, guys. Take a chill pill. To all of you out there who get offended when there is a cross on the roadside where someone died because it's on public land. Someone gets offended at the fact that it's a cross. Have you nothing better to do in life than to get annoyed, or to actually look at things to be annoyed at? Just ignore it. Nobody is forcing you to worship Jesus by putting a cross there. Nobody is forcing you to believe in God by having a engraving of the Ten Commandments on a wall somewhere. Nobody is forcing you to participate in that. Just calm down. Okay, that was me. That was me on my soapbox, because some people just get really upset. Okay, federation. Federalism is a system in which the power to govern is shared between national and provincial governments. This decentralization minimizes the corruption and waste caused by distance to capital and avoids separatist movements. Okay, and we already talked about republic and democracy. So generally, what I would say about the government under Donald Trump, what is Donald Trump doing nowadays in the government? I'd have to say that although the United States has a root in federalism, which is also not mutually exclusive in its root in republicanism, as well as having democracy in there, which has increased in its portion over time. I'd have to say that if I had to pick one that's specifically in there, because I'm going to be honest, federalism has decreased over time, and Donald Trump's style of leadership doesn't look like the kind that is going to increase states' powers. And so I'd have to say it's a republic, just like Obama, just like Bush, just like Clinton, just like the other Bush, just like Reagan. It hasn't changed that much in its fundamental structure. Now, of course, if there were some sort of constitutional reforms that Donald Trump would enact that would be transformative in some way, then I'd have to say that things have changed. But overall, I have to say that things haven't changed in that respect. So thank you, FreeCivWeb, for asking these questions. Hopefully they were satisfactory. I just want to say again that I don't mean to offend anyone with my opinions. I just like to say my opinions. How's that offensive, sharing one's opinions? I'm not forcing them down anybody's throat. And if you'd like to respond to me, anybody who's watching, please do so in the comments below. It's always interesting to interact with others in an intellectual context. Now, however, let us move on to the final issue here right now. Okay, Amphibian Hoplite asks, why covenant theology? In parentheses, I don't know the difference between neo-covenant, classical, etc. Now, this is a very in-depth question. That's why I left it for the end. This is a very in-depth question. If you're not a Christian and you happen to be listening, I recommend that you continue, because even if you're not interested in this kind of thing, it still is interesting to know about, so that if you ever talk to someone about such things, it at least you know what they're talking about. And in addition to that, I'm very glad that someone asked me a theological question, and that is definitely what I'm going to answer. Now, I do have to confess that this isn't something that this specific subject regarding covenant theology, dispensationalism, etc., is not something that I personally have studied very deeply into, and also I am not a professional theologian. In other words, I don't have a degree in theology. However, the description that I'm going to give is based on the way I think about it, and is in no way meant to be a comprehensive description of these theological issues. It's just my perspective on them. As such, I recommend that anyone who is listening, who takes issue with what I say, maybe leaves a comment if there's something that needs to be corrected. But the best thing you can do is to research this on your own as well, so that you get a fuller view on this, because these things can be very complicated. And let's get right into it. Okay, what is covenant theology, and what do I mean when I say dispensationalism? Okay, so covenant theology, I've opened Wikipedia now, just so you know. Generally speaking, Wikipedia pages are relatively reliable because they're very, very frequently peer-reviewed, but don't take everything that you read on Wikipedia as absolute fact, just like you don't take anything you read in an academic paper or in another book as absolute fact. But for the purposes of what I'm going to say today, Wikipedia is going to suffice. Covenant theology, also known as covenantalism, federal theology, or federalism, is a conceptual overview and interpretive framework for understanding the overall flow of the Bible. It uses the theological concept of a covenant as an organizing principle for Christian theology. The standard form of covenant theology views the history of God's dealings with mankind from creation to fall to redemption to consummation under the framework of three overarching theological covenants of redemption, works, and grace. Okay, let's stop here. What in the world just came out of my mouth is what some of you may be asking. Well, anyway, when it says it's an interpretive framework for understanding the overall flow of the Bible, that's specifically talking about when you read the Bible, there is a narrative in the Bible where it goes from the creation of the world, and it goes through successive generations, and various things happen in the various generations, and you end up with things called covenants, or a covenant is sort of agreement that is made, or a promise, depending on how you want to contextualize it. And covenant theology is a viewpoint that organizes these things. And it is generally seen as opposed to what is called dispensationalism. So, what is dispensationalism? Okay, I've got a page open for that as well. Dispensationalism is a religious interpretive system for the Bible, it considers biblical history as divided deliberately by God into defined periods or ages, to each of which God has allotted distinctive administrative principles. According to dispensationalist interpretation, each age of the plan of God is thus administered in a certain way, and humanity is held responsible as a steward during that time. The harmony of history is demonstrated by focusing on the glory of God and puts God at its center, as opposed to a central focus on man and humanity's need for salvation. A dispensational perspective of Scripture is claimed to explain apparent contradictions that make sense of the whole of the Bible. The system was embraced by early fundamentalist Christianity as a defense of the Bible against liberalism and modernism, and became the majority position within fundamentalism. Now, it's important to note that when they're talking about fundamentalism, they're talking about a movement that originated in the late 19th, early 20th century, where many of the ideas of the 19th century were coming up. For example, Darwinism, and among other things. And the Christians responded by deciding to get back to their fundamentals. And in addition to that, there were also revivals during this time, church revivals and such things. But from a surface viewpoint, it may seem that these two things have that all they are is a different view to look at the historiography of the events of the Bible, the periodization of events. That's what it may seem like from a surface viewpoint. However, it is not that simple, and that is why this is an important issue. It's an important issue because while if it were just historiography, if it were just periodization, I would just say it's not important. But there are some things that can greatly affect the way Christians behave based on the viewpoints they take on these things. So there's actually more than just two viewpoints regarding these things. There's, according to Wikipedia, there's at least 7, where you have dual covenant theology, classical dispensationalism, progressive dispensationalism, new covenant theology, covenant premillennialism, covenant theology, and supersessionism. And those are 7 things that are defined as a spectrum of viewpoints about Church Israel distinctions. And this is where it really gets into the deep parts here, the depth of it. The depth of it is because of the claims that dispensationalism makes. Now, it is important to note that the origin of dispensationalism is in the 19th century, based on the writings of John Nelson Darby, who also popularized his viewpoints on eschatology as well. Eschatology being the study of things to come. Meanwhile, covenant theology has existed for much longer. It seems to be implied in some of the writings of early church fathers, but it is definitely clearly stated in the writings of some of the reformers. And of course, the reformers had different viewpoints on what these things are. So, I'm not going to go into what all the dispensations are, because to be honest, there are reasons for which I reject dispensationalism, and they're not necessarily because of its periodization. But anyway, according to Wikipedia, main concepts in dispensationalism are progressive revelation, which is defined as one important underlying theological concept for dispensationalism is progressive revelation. Some non-dispensationalists start with progressive revelation in the New Testament and refer this revelation back into the Old Testament, whereas dispensationalists begin with progressive revelation in the Old Testament and read forward in a historical sense. Therefore, there is an emphasis on a gradually developed unity as seen in the entirety of Scripture. Biblical covenants are associated with the dispensations. In other words, when someone says dispensationalism, that even though the word dispensation doesn't appear in the Bible, it frequently refers to various covenants. And the concept of a progressive revelation in the context of dispensationalism is that there is a dispensation made at the end of a period of time. And this is usually in the form of a covenant, but many times it's not. So, for example, the different periods can exist. There's actually a number of different periods in dispensationalism. There's 8 steps to 3 steps of the different dispensations that they have. They have the one where the Edenic, the antediluvian, the one of civil government, the one of the patriarchs, the one of Moses, and one of the church, the one of the millennial kingdom, and the one of the final one of eternity, I suppose, that comes after that. Now, my opinion on progressive revelation, which is the concept that the sections of the Bible that were written later contain a fuller revelation of God compared to the earlier sections, my opinion on that is that I conditionally approve of it, in the sense that it depends on how you contextualize it, in the sense that obviously you get more information as more portions of the Bible are written, because for example, if it weren't that way, that would mean that all of the Bible besides the books of Moses would be deuterocanonical, which would mean they would essentially be a non-essential repetition of things that were already written in other books, and therefore not very important. Which is, to some extent, what I think the Sadducees believed. I think they rejected a lot of the prophetic and poetic writings. Meanwhile, they just went with the Pentateuch, or the Torah, while the Pharisees preferred the entirety of the Tanakh, and eventually the Talmud as well, or at least what eventually would become the Talmud. But that's a whole other context, a whole other conversation. I'm going to go on a lot of tangents in this question. It's going to be a very long question. I apologize that it's already 14 minutes into this question. Holy cannoli, this is going to take a long time. Anyway. Okay, but I'm going to answer it to the best of my ability. That's what I'm here for. So I think that if it is taken in the context of God fixing things, or God changing things, or God adding things that weren't in the plan before, I disapprove of that specific viewpoint on it. Because it, of course, denies sovereignty, which is very important for a huge number of reasons. But it all depends on how you contextualize progressive revelation. So another aspect of dispensationalism is the historical grammatical interpretation or the literal method of Bible interpretation. And that, of course, means that the things that are written in the Bible, especially some of the miracles, or all of the miracles to be exact, actually happened. And I think that's something that mainstream Christianity can agree on, that these things did happen. Now, of course, if you're not a Christian, you're going to disagree. Unless you're a Muslim, in which case you wouldn't disagree, or in most cases, or many cases, or if you're a Judaist, you wouldn't disagree for stuff that happened in the Tanakh. But unless you're one of those people that does disagree and rejects the events that are stated to have happened as being historical. But I have many reasons to go into the historicity of these events, but I'm not going to go super deeply into it. The thing that I'm going to say, though, is that when I read the Bible, it is confirmed to me by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit that these things are true, which is, of course, objectionable to people who don't believe in the Holy Spirit. But dispensationalists profess a definite distinction between Israel and the church. Now, this is probably the big issue here between dispensationalism and covenant theology. For dispensationalists, Israel is an ethnic nation consisting of Hebrews, in parentheses, Israelites, beginning with Abraham and continuing in existence to the present. The church, on the other hand, consists of all saved individuals in this present dispensation, i.e., from the birth of the church in Acts until the time of the rapture. That's going to be very important because it deals with eschatology. According to progressive dispensationalism, in contrast to the older forms, the distinction between Israel and the church is not mutually exclusive, as there is a recognized overlap between the two. In other words, the progressive dispensationalists, who are dispensationalists who had revised the dispensationalism, they had revised dispensationalism or progressive dispensationalism that differed with the views of classic dispensationalism such as Darby and Schofield. They looked at the Jews and the Israelites, the ethnic Jews to be exact, and they noticed that some of them are Christians, which, according to the original classical dispensationalism, is not something that's true. Okay. This overlap consists of Jewish Christians such as Peter and Paul, who are ethnically Jewish and also have faith in Jesus Christ. Dispensationalists also believe that Israel as a nation will embrace Jesus as their Messiah toward the end of the tribulation, right before his second coming. The spectrum of teaching on Israel and the church may be depicted as below, and I already talked about that specific thing if you look on the Wikipedia page for dispensationalism. But anyway, another distinction between different types of dispensationalism is where they believe that the dispensation of the church or grace began. And usually it's at varying points in the book of Acts they believe that it happened. So you've got the classic Pauline dispensationalists, you've got the hyper-dispensationalists, the mid-Acts dispensationalists, the ultra-dispensationalists that view it with Acts 28. I'm not going to go into that because that's very complicated, and honestly, I already reject dispensationalism for other reasons, so it's not really important to me to go into this specific thing. But, was there something that I specifically wanted to talk about before I moved on? Okay. And it continues. Classical dispensationalists refer to the present-day church as a parenthesis or temporary interlude in the progress of Israel's prophesied history. Progressive dispensationalism softens the church-Israel distinction by seeing some Old Testament promises as extended by the New Testament to include the church. However, progressives never view the extension as replacing promises to its original audience, Israel. So, moving on from there. Another thing that you would probably hear some old-fashioned dispensationalists say. I don't think this is something very common anymore. But, for example, when in Genesis, it talks about Abraham's descendants being as the stars in heaven and as the sand in the sea. There used to be, I don't think many dispensationalists do this anymore because it's really silly to do, but because if you look later in the Bible, it refutes the argument that I'm about to present. It used to be viewed by some dispensationalists that the stars referred to the Christians and the sand referred to the Jews, therefore referring to two separate groups. Of course, later on, we find out that in the Tanakh, it refers to the Jews in the same way as the stars. So it really refutes that, and of course that was discovered, and any dispensationalists that had that view eventually moved away from it. Now let me just say that my views on dispensationalism and covenant theology and related issues are things that I hold to be non-essential, or to be exact, non-fatal. In other words, if I were in charge of a church and someone walked into my church and started spouting this viewpoint, I would not kick that person out unless that person became really annoying, of course, and really overbearing and tried to shove it down everybody's throat, which is an entirely different issue. But I would not shove someone out for having that viewpoint or for sharing that viewpoint. It is not something I consider to be super heresy that, oh my goodness, you're a classical dispensationalist, you are going to hell. No, I do not do that. I do not consider that, nor do I believe that this is a specific issue that is related to somebody that allows me to say whether or not somebody could have salvation, because I don't think that's related to the specific issue of dispensationalism versus covenant theology, because historically Arminians have had... I'm also not saying that Arminians aren't Christians either. I'm just saying that... okay, Arminian Calvinist distinction for another time. Let's just shove it out the door. I'm not going to get into that right now, because holy cannoli, if I go in any deeper, I'm going to be here all day and all night. Okay. Okay. Classical dispensationalists such as Scofield and Ironside, followed by revised dispensationalists, identify Pentecost in Acts 2 with the start of the church as distinct from Israel. In other words, that is the point where they believe that there is a distinction between the church and Israel. This may be referred to as the Acts 2 position. Grace movement dispensationalists believe that the church started later in Acts and emphasize the beginning of the church with the ministry of Paul. Advocates of this mid-Acts position identify the start of the church variously with the salvation of Saul in Acts 9 to the Holy Spirit commissioning of Paul in Acts 13. The Acts 28 position posits the beginning of the church in Acts chapter 28, where the Apostle Paul quotes Isaiah 6:9 and 10 concerning with the blindness of Israel, pronouncing that the salvation of God is sent to the Gentile world. Acts 28:28. Okay, eschatology-wise, dispensationalists are premillennialists always, by the way. Always. It's almost always something that's related to dispensationalism, is that the eschatology of it is part of the package in dispensationalism, who affirm a future literal 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ, which merges with and continues on to the eternal state in the new heavens and the new earth, and they claim that the millennial kingdom will be theocratic in nature and not mainly soteriological, as it is considered by George Eldon Ladd and others, with a non-dispensational form of premillennialism. Dispensationalism is known for its opinions regarding the nation of Israel during this millennial kingdom reign, in which Israel as a nation plays a major role and regains a king, a land, and an everlasting kingdom. The vast majority of dispensationalists profess the pre-tribulation rapture, with small minorities professing to either a mid-tribulation or post-tribulation rapture. Okay, holy cannoli. That was long. But now I'm going to contrast that with covenant theology. Okay, covenant theology divides... okay, let me read, because my brain is just burned today. The nature of God's covenantal relationship with his creation is not considered automatic or of necessity. Rather, God chooses to establish the connection as a covenant, wherein the terms of the relationship are set down by God alone according to his will. Having created man in his image, as a free creature with knowledge, righteousness, and holiness, God entered into a covenant of works, whereby the mandate was, do this and live. Like Adam, they have trespassed the covenant, and it gives verse references. In the classic reference of the covenant of works, Hebrews 8:6, 9:15, 12:24, the reference that explains God's work of redemption in the covenant of grace. Okay, the covenant of works, in Latin, foedus operum, or foedus operum, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Also called the covenant of life, was made in the Garden of Eden between God and Adam, who represented all mankind as a federal head. It promises life for the perfect and perpetual obedience and death for disobedience. Adam and all mankind in Adam broke the covenant, thus standing condemned. The covenant of works continues to function after the fall as the moral law. Now, this is something that is considered essentially what this means is that Adam was given the command not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that was essentially the covenant of works, that by a work Adam could corrupt himself and become mortal. Or that's essentially what it is. Now, the covenant of grace promises eternal life to all people who have faith in Christ. He also promises the Holy Spirit to the elect to give them willingness and ability to believe. Christ is the substitutionary covenantal representative, fulfilling the covenant of works on their behalf in both the positive requirements of righteousness and the negative penal consequences, commonly described as his active and passive doctrine. It is the historical expression of the eternal covenant of redemption, Genesis 3:15, and the promise of a seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head is usually identified as the historical inauguration as the covenant of grace. What this means is that the covenant of grace in covenant theology, as opposed to the dispensationalism of grace, it doesn't actually start with the physical death of Christ. In other words, the salvation by grace precedes Christ's physical death, and instead is necessary immediately upon the sin of Adam, because in the original sin, all humans are corrupted, or have, as the Calvinists would say, become totally depraved. And because of this, it requires someone who is not depraved to, in order to get the mercy so that the people who have committed sin can live. Someone must be offered as the substitutionary atonement. And of course, then you have the imputation of grace as well as the imputation of sin, wherein Jesus Christ's grace, Jesus Christ's not imputation of grace, the imputation of righteousness. Jesus Christ's righteousness is put on to the people that sinned, and the sin of those people is put on Jesus Christ so that Christ can die for their sins. And because Christ died for their sins are forgiven. Now, of course, the imputation also implies limited atonement if hell exists, and because hell is stated to exist in the Bible, and the Bible and all Scripture is phanostos, or God-breathed, it means that hell is real, and if salvation is by that substitutionary atonement and the imputation and redemption, then that means that limited atonement is the natural consequence, because without limited atonement, you deny the imputation of righteousness and the imputation of sin of Jesus Christ. And if Christ dies with that imputation, or in other words, if Christ's sacrifice is effective, then anyone who Christ died for cannot be someone who goes to hell. But I'm getting way too deep into Calvinism here. I know that offends some people, but that's just my viewpoint. But now let's move on to the final covenant, which is the covenant of redemption, which is the eternal agreement within the Godhead, in which the Father appointed the Son to become incarnate, suffer, and die as a federal head of mankind to make an atonement for their sin. Now, this means this. Some people might object to this, saying, "How does this work?" Because, well, it works because God is one being in three persons, and that is how it works. And also, Jesus talks about interacting with the Father and interacting with the Holy Spirit, and so that shows that there is interaction there. In addition to that, another thing that is important is when, I think it's John the Baptist who says this, "Behold the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world," which implies that it was the intention to sacrifice Jesus from even before when Adam sinned, implying that this is an eternal covenant. Now, of course, if God is eternal, which means God is outside of outside of one-dimensional time, and depending on your viewpoint of time can either be a ray. In other words, time has a definite beginning and God created time. Some people believe that time is a line, as in it goes in both directions, even before creation, infinitely. But that is not a problem. And people raise the objection: what did God do for those billions and infinite to ad infinitum years before God created the world? Even if time is interpreted as working in that way, which, by the way, there is no evidence that there is a past beyond the beginning, that is still not a problem in Christianity, because God is eternal, which means that he is omnipresent in time. And we see that in the statement, I am that I am, or before Abraham was, I am the one who was and is to come. And that shows that anything that God does is done from eternity, and even if its effects are felt in a one-dimensional time frame, it is actually an interaction that occurs from a zero-dimensional time frame, in which this one-dimensional time frame is compressed via perspective of an eternal sense. And I'm getting really metaphysical here, but anyway, the reason that I reject dispensationalism is because I'm not dogmatic about covenant theology. Before I begin, I'm not dogmatic about it, in the sense that I mean that I think it's an accurate description of what happens, but if I'm not going to be dogmatic about the specific terminology relating to it. But the eschatological aspects of dispensationalism are really... Well, let's get into the big issue. Okay, the big issue, the issue that is going to be highly controversial here. I'm not going to go too deep into the eschatology. I'm actually going to go into the Church-Israel relation and the Church-Israel distinction. Now, the various viewpoints on this. How long have they been running on this question? 37 minutes. Oh my goodness. That's going to be a very long question and answer video. But the distinction between the various viewpoints. Dual covenant theology teaches that, if I remember correctly, that Judaism is an equally valid religion as Christianity. In other words, its means to salvation are equally true, which I have to reject. And the reason I reject that is, by the way, dual covenant theology is not the same thing as covenant theology. It refers to a different kind of covenant, referring to covenants regarding the church and Israel, and the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, Old Testament, New Testament. That's what it's referring to. But the reason that I have a problem with this, that is because number one, the gospel, as it is clearly stated in Acts and other places in the New Testament as well, was first preached to the Jews. In other words, the Christian gospel was first preached to the Jews intentionally and then to the Gentiles, which means that it was intentionally preached to Jews from the very beginning, and the salvation of Jews that are mentioned in the New Testament clearly confirms this. And another thing here is Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. There is no way. There's no way. Oh my goodness! I gotta get this quote right. I don't want to misquote. So I'm going to look that up real quick. Okay, it's John 14:6. Jesus saith unto him, I'm reading King James Version because that's the least controversial here, even though there are some issues with it. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. What this means is that Jesus Christ is the only way to become saved. That is what he says when he. That is what he means when he says, "I am the way." There's no other way to the Father but by me. And then you can also add, "No man may come unto me except the Father draw him," and that's Calvinist issues. Hey, okay. Okay. So in addition to that, relating to dual covenant theology, it's also stated that it is very clearly emphasized in the New Testament that you are not a Christian if you worship a false Christ, or in the case of Judaism, if you reject the real Christ. And that is why I make that distinction, because it is, Jesus is important, and if you have dual covenant theology, it really undermines the importance of Jesus, the importance of the Christ. The means to salvation is what Judaism rejects. In addition to that, rabbinical Judaism has a lot of extra stuff that, by looking at it, I from my perspective, I think that the Talmud is entirely apocryphal and heretical even, but I guess that doesn't matter to people if you have already rejected Christ. Now, that being said, when I say that the Jews have rejected Christ, I mean as a religion. I am talking about the Judaists, not the ethnic Jews. In addition to that, when I condemn this, I'm talking about Judaism. Just so you know, I'm not saying anything anti-Semitic here. Okay. And we already know about the progressive dispensationalist view. Now, in covenant theology, the way covenant theology relates to the Jews is that everyone is saved in the same manner. That is, by grace for faith, and as it clearly states in... let me see. I think it's somewhere in Philippians. We are the true circumcision, is something that Paul writes. And then you have things such as being circumcised in the heart, and another thing I'd like to emphasize is that the law has not passed, but the law has been fulfilled, and that means that the ceremonial aspects of the law are fulfilled in Jesus Christ. The reason that Christians don't have sacrifices is because they have the perfect sacrifice in Jesus Christ, and the moral code remains the same, because morality is independent of whether or not it's written. And the reason the law is written is for legal reasons, that is, to convict people when they break it, or specifically to convict people when they break moral laws. Now, other positions is New Covenant theology. New Covenant theology says, the Wikipedia says, it is a Christian theological position teaching that the person and work of Jesus Christ is the central focus of the Bible. One distinctive result of this is that the Old Testament laws have been abrogated or cancelled with Jesus' crucifixion and replaced with the law of Christ of a new covenant. It shares similarities and yet is distinct from dispensationalism and covenant theology. The reason I reject this is because Jesus says, no jot, no tittle shall pass on the law till all these things are fulfilled, and all those things haven't been fulfilled yet. And I come not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. So the law still applies, it's just the interpretation of the law that is different because of things that have happened, which is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and such things. But that is a deeper subject. And supersessionism teaches that it's also called replacement theology or fulfillment theology, is a Christian theological view on the current status of the church in relation to the Jewish people and Judaism. It holds that the Christian church has succeeded the Israelites as the definitive people of God, or that the new covenant has replaced or superseded the Mosaic covenant. From the supersessionist's point of view, just by continuing to exist outside of the church, the Jews dissent. This view directly contrasts with dual covenant theology, which holds that the Mosaic covenant remains valid for Jews. Now, the reason I am not a supersessionist is because I believe that there is not a distinction between Israel, the nation of Israel, in a theological sense, and the church, in the sense that there is some. The church has a definite beginning with being established by Jesus Christ, but overall, as being the same in the covenant of grace, it is a continuation. As Paul says, we are the true circumcision. Let me see if I can find that real quick. The verse. Let's see. Okay. It says, Philippians 3. Not we are the true circumcision. I'm sorry, I added that word. I heavily apologize. Okay. For we are the circumcision which worship God in the Spirit and rejoice in Christ Jesus and have no conscience in the flesh. And again, the nature of the covenants have always been conditional, in the sense that historically speaking, in the law of Moses, people could get excluded from the people of Israel for doing certain things, and other people could be added to the people of Israel if they chose to follow the laws of Moses. And such things are evident in, let's say, Ruth, for example, who was a Moabitess and joined Israel. So, and also there's the analogy with cutting the olive branch and grafting branches on. But overall, I do not believe that the church has replaced Israel, but rather that the church is Israel in the form that has been fulfilled, in that the gospel has first been preached to the Jews and then to the Gentiles, and such things. Now, if anyone would like to debate me with on these issues, or to ask further questions, feel free to do so in the comments. I do not wish to have an angry argument with anyone. I prefer to have a civilized discussion, and if you want me to make a more in-depth video on this specific issue, then please go ahead. But my goodness, I have been talking for over an hour now, and that's drying out my throat. So thank you all for watching. I might do this one another Q&A when I get to around 100 subs. And I will be seeing you all next time. Anawultus over and out.